Joining us now, MS Now senior national security reporter David Rode, former assistant special agent in charge at the FBI, and MS Now national security and intelligence analyst Michael Feinberg, and senior fellow for Middle East and Africa studies at the Council on Foreign Relations, Stephen Cook, and host of the Independent Americans podcast and founder and CEO of Independent Veterans of America, Paul Reichoff. Paul always has to sit next to me. That's just how this goes. David, I'll start with you. Let's take the first part of President Trump's post. He's claiming that we have massive amounts of munitions and more are being manufactured. We've seen Reuters report that the U.S. has indeed signed a more than $3 billion deal with major weapons manufacturers to ramp up production of the Patriot and the THAAD interceptor parts. Where's the truth here, though? Where does our defensive weapons cache currently stand?
It's depleted. It's not empty, but it's depleted. And it takes time for these kind of missiles to be made, the Patriots in particular. But the Trump administration has had time to plan for what was going to play out when they chose to go to war with Iran. So this is no surprise. And I think it's good. I'm biased as a journalist, but in terms of the last part of the tweet, that this is somehow treasonous, 50,000 Americans are risking their lives right now for this country in the Persian Gulf. If they do not have the weapons they need to defend themselves, it's our job as journalists, if we have credible sources, to report that. And so it's astonishing to me that the President of the United States is saying whoever leaked this is guilty of treason and that they should be hunted down and get a long jail sentence. These service members deserve proper weapons.
To David's point, Paul, hunted down the sources of this. How can you hunt down, quote unquote, leakers or sources if you're not really denying the underpinning of what they've leaked?
Bingo. Yeah. I mean, if what they're saying is false, why is he trying to hunt them down? I think the bigger picture here is that the world is sick of Hegseth and his crap. And the country is sick of his crap, and the military is sick of his crap, and I think Trump's starting to get sick of his crap. And his misstatements, his false truths, his lies, and his inability to report accurately what's happening on the ground and to include our stockpiles. So I think Pete Hegseth has always been on stable footing, supposedly, and they keep reiterating that, which means he may be soon seeing the underside of a bus pretty soon. This is not going well, and Trump is not good at taking responsibility for himself. Hegseth did not take responsibility himself. He blamed a subordinate, which is the failure of leadership again. But someone's going to have to be held accountable here, and Trump usually looks for a scapegoat.
Michael, if sources close to the president were privy to those discussions at Camp David and they're expressing these concerns about the depletion of our stockpile to the media, as David says, what does that signal to you?
It signals a few things to me, and I want to be clear. I was a national security investigator for most of my lifetime. I probably have a different opinion on how media leaks should be investigated than many of the members of this panel. Well, I mean, in general, I think there is a national security interest in protecting certain secret information from public if that information could be used by our adversaries against us. But in this case, my main takeaway is something totally different. And my main takeaway is that if an administration as riddled with ideological loyalists as this one is still leaking, that tells us that the situation is probably far more alarming than we actually realize. The difference between Trump 2 and Trump 1 is that there are no grown-ups this time who are taking their jobs out of a sense of obligation to be the adult in the room. Everybody knows what working for Trump is like at this point. And so the people who are going to work with him are not doing so out of a sense of patriotism or noblesse oblige or public service. They're doing it because they idolize the person who has become the personalist incarnation of the Republican Party. So if they're willing to leak what is going on behind closed doors, that really tells you something has gone off the rails.
Yeah, I think that's a point well taken. David, the Joint Chiefs Chair, Dan Kane, had warned about munition shortages even before this war began. According to the Washington Post, were those warnings essentially ignored? How serious were they back then, and compare it to now?
Yeah, the shortage of these munitions and how much they cost has been known for months, if not years. Right when the war started, we were reporting also on these warnings from Kane. So, again, this goes back to the president and also Secretary Hegseth. They, when you decide to go launch a major war like this, you have to consider worst case scenarios. And there's no question that what has happened is by far the worst case scenario and something the White House didn't anticipate. But it's their job to anticipate it. So they used huge amounts of weapons and different kinds of advanced bombs in the first days of the war. There were thousands of them dropped. And now they have a problem. But this is called planning. This is called competence. And they did not think through the worst case scenario. They appear to have been, just overconfident. And now, again, service members are now paying the price for poor planning.
And, Stephen, of course, there is this global dimension to this. Trump has said that it was our Middle East allies who urged him to call off the so-called major strike that he had been planning on Iran. And the reporting is that that's in large part because of the lack of defensive capabilities to thwart off any kind of retaliation from Iran. How vulnerable are our Middle East allies in the region, and how does that impact the course of the war?
They're quite vulnerable. We saw from the last round of actual conflict between the United States and Iran that the Kuwaitis, the Bahrainis, the Qataris were hit and hit very hard. And that's because they don't have the interceptors, and the United States doesn't have the interceptors to protect them. The Saudis find themselves under fire from the Houthis again, and thanks only to NATO forces like Greek forces, who on a bilateral basis are in Saudi Arabia to help protect sensitive sites, has the damage in Saudi Arabia not been as devastating as it could be. The other real-world consequence of this is, of course, it puts the United States in a relatively weaker negotiating position when it comes to the Iranians. The Iranians know, and America's partners know, that the United States cannot protect them. And so when it comes down to a negotiation, it's more likely for the United States and its partners on the other side of the Gulf to accept an agreement that most likely will favor Iran and its demands over having some control over the Strait of Hormuz.
So talk to me, Stephen, about how our adversaries are viewing all of this when you have the telegraphing of the depletion of munitions. To Michael's point, it may be contrary to national security interests that we now know all of this information, but how do forces like Russia and China view this?
Well, of course, since the very beginning of this conflict, and from the moment that the Iranians tried to close the Strait of Hormuz, the Chinese in particular have been paying close attention to how the United States would go about opening a waterway. So this is a very significant challenge, not just in the Middle East, but globally for the United States. These munitions, people talk about them as being built in a factory. It's more like workshops. It takes about a year to produce a Patriot missile. So this is going to be a long-term issue if we have expended as many as studies like the one coming out of the Center for Strategic and International Studies and the leaks coming out of the Pentagon would suggest.
Paul, NBC News reports citing two senior officials that U.S. commanders are picking and choosing which Iranian missiles they should just let fall and which ones to intercept. How concerning should that be for our military servicemen and women and their families who are watching all of this unfold?
Deeply, especially considering how many have already gotten through and wounded and killed American forces. I think when it comes to Trump and Hegseth, you can't believe what they say. You have to watch what they do. And they're asking for $67 billion more. About $20 billion of that is for weapons and for munitions. We know we're using Tomahawks and ATACMS and Patriots, and we need them badly, and our allies need them badly. Meanwhile, Ukraine's getting pummeled, and the civilians there are dying by the day. Women and children are being killed, and they don't have enough munitions. So it's a great example of a misallocation of resources where Trump got way ahead of his skis. He didn't plan adequately. He didn't ask Congress for support, and he didn't ask Congress for enough money to fund what was turned out to be a very protracted war that's
now
making
they're asking
everyone
for $67 billion more. Just
and
put a fine point on that.
And $1.5 trillion at the end of the year.
Yeah. Michael, I do want to turn to the New York Times reporting that cites the FBI that there have been hacks of water systems at least almost a dozen different water systems across the country. There have been years of warning and neglect, according to the New York Times. Are we prepared to counter even a more serious attack than what we've seen on civilian infrastructure, whether it's water, our power grids?
I don't think so. I don't think we're remotely prepared. And I want to hasten to add that vulnerability is a choice. For years, if not decades, the private sector industries that make up much of our critical infrastructure have resisted security upgrades and any sort of oversight and regulation because it adds costs to their operations. Good security creates friction. It demands resources. It lessens usability sometime, but it's insurance. And we are now seeing the result of not having insurance. When you compound that with the fact that the Trump administration has decimated an organization called CISA, which traditionally did most of the government side of this type of security, this is entirely expectable. And unfortunately, Americans need to realize this is the future of warfare. We have networked everything in our lives, which means it is now vulnerable to cyber attack. And the oceans on either side of our continent are no longer protection against those with whom we would go to war.